Hey guys, I'm Caden, and welcome to my pod, where we talk about the principles of design. Today we're going to be talking about this piece that I drew of a shepherd. This can be interpreted religiously or non-religiously, but full disclosure, I definitely embedded a lot of symbolism in this piece. Don't worry, I'm not going to turn this video into a testimonial. So this piece took a total of 6.5 hours from start to finish, and I'm going to take you along on a ride as I explain the process and the principles of design that I applied to this piece to come up with the final result. So to start out, I laid down some thumbnails. And with these thumbnails, I established a range of values that I could use as guidelines in my final piece. The three most important elements of any design are shape, color, and edges. Each one of these elements can be divided into sub-elements. For instance, color can be simplified down to hue, chroma, and value. And in the beginning stages of any painting, the most important sub-element of color is value. And so establishing a range of values early on can set a foundation for success of your piece. And what I mean by establishing a range of values is to pick the three most used values: your light value, your dark value, and your midtones. These three values are what are used to establish the composition of the piece. So in these thumbnails, I am using color to establish a theme and a mood in each thumbnail. But my main focus is on the values and establishing that range so that I can obey it in the final piece. To be honest, I generally don't do this step when creating an artwork, maybe out of laziness or pride. I feel like I don't need to do thumbnails. I just go straight into sketching and visualizing the piece. I don't recommend that. I recommend slowing down, taking your time, setting up the composition, exploring other options to find other compositions that would work. Because I found as I worked on this piece that because I had a thumbnail established to create a sort of strong foundation to fall back on, it gave me a lot more comfort, freedom, and creativity in the final piece when I knew that the composition and the values as a whole would work. So I end up using the fall colors, and I loved this slanted hill look that I was getting out of 3 of the 4 thumbnails. I loved the way that the light was catching just the top half of the subject and leaving the majority of the ground in shadow. So then I put the thumbnail on its own project and off to the side, which I frequently refer to as I'm sketching out this piece. When sketching, this is where the second of the 3 most important elements come into play. So we established values, and now with sketching, you're establishing the shapes of the piece. And as I'm doing this, I'm constantly referring to my thumbnail to make sure that my shapes are falling within the composition that I previously established, because I want to preserve that composition as much as possible. I actually end up deviating from the thumbnail, but keeping the value range. I put the shepherd's cane, the shepherd's hook, on the other side of him. I felt this was important for a few reasons. One is it put him in front of the sheep for symbolic purposes. And 2, I think it helps drive the viewer's eye to the subject. It's a very clear and instant way for the viewer to know who the subject is. He's a shepherd. So after I'm done sketching out the piece, I go in with the colors, and you can't see on this screen, but I have my thumbnail off to the side that I'm continually referring to make sure that my values stay true to the composition. Because as you lay in colors, for me, it's very common and it's an easy trap to break the value range that I had previously set. It's easy for me to get carried away in this stage and sort of break my composition that I previously established. So you have to be really careful when adding color that you maintain that range of values. Not only do I continually refer to my thumbnail that I created, but I also have a lot of references to sheep, shepherd clothes, fall trees, shepherd hooks. All sorts of references are on my other screen that I can continually look back on to make sure that my piece is cohesive and consistent with reality. So as I'm laying in the colors, this is where the third element of design comes into play: edges. There are a countless number of edges that can be defined, but the four most common that I use are hard edges, firm edges, soft edges, and lost edges. You can imagine that those different types of edges become increasingly less visible and noticeable. Utilizing these four different edges, you can better support your piece and the focal point. Hard edges create contrast that attracts the eye, while soft and lost edges can serve as a contrast to those hard edges and focus the viewer's eye on the hard edges. So we talked about elements, values, shapes, and edges. Each one of these elements can be used in different ways to establish principles of design. Let's take contrast, for example. We can use values to create contrast. The subject in this painting is lit, which is bringing the values forward, bringing them lighter than the foreground, lighter than the background. This is creating a contrast and drawing attention to the subject. Shapes can create contrast in much the same way as value. If we look at this piece, for example, the sky in the foreground and the trees even are these large shapes all going in the same direction. But the subject, his shape and angles and lines are going in a perpendicular direction, creating a contrast. Edges can be used to create contrast in a simple way of making the focal point out of mainly hard edges and blending the background and other supplementary shapes and edges with soft and lost edges. Our eye and brain does this naturally without us even thinking about it. If you look at your hand, for instance, it has very firm and hard edges, but the background and your peripherals become very blurred, soft, and even lost. We can achieve this in painting as we create a focal point, a focus that we can create out of firm lines, out of firm edges, and then the background out of soft and lost edges. We can create a focal point that our eyes will naturally be attracted to. The viewer's eyes will naturally be attracted to. As I briefly touched on in my first video, the artist can utilize elements and principles of design in order to train the eye of the viewer and lead and guide the eye to the focal point. I once said in one of these videos that contrast is arguably the most important principle of design, and I stand by that. However, I have learned, even recently, that it is also the most misused and misunderstood principles of design. By me, I misunderstand it. Full disclosure, I'm still learning the principles of design. You cannot progress as a person or an artist if you believe that you have figured it out. If you believe that you don't need to learn anymore. So I'm still on the hunt to understand the elements and principles of design on a deeper and deeper level and be able to utilize them more and more efficiently in my art. That being said, I think I misuse and misunderstand contrast more than any other principle of design. Because as we have established at the beginning of this episode, having a clear range of values is crucial to having a readable and interesting composition. And contrast, used incorrectly, can absolutely destroy that composition that has been established at the beginning. So I'm trying to learn to use contrast sparingly. If you want to learn more about my understanding of contrast, be sure to comment below and let me know, and I'll make a video maybe even a series dedicated to that principle of design. Now, going back to the piece, I've been editing edges and shapes and values and tweaking them to establish the form of the character. So I want to try to explain some of the symbolism that I tried to establish in this piece. One being the lighting. If you notice, the subject is the only one who can see the sun. He's the only one who has eyes above the tree line. All the sheep are in the shadow, but the sheep, as they're feeding, rely so heavily on their shepherd to lead and guide them as they feed. In my life, I get very distracted. I lose focus on the goals that I have for myself and for my future. And I get carried away, much as these sheep do, grazing and living in the moment, unable to see the predators and the dangers around me. But as I rely on a higher power that can see much further and much more than I can, I find stability and peace that I have yet to find anywhere else. So I tried to capture that in this piece, with the subject looking into the sun, as the sheep confidently and comfortably graze upon the land with the knowledge that their loving shepherd is watching over them. So I think that'll be it for this episode of my pod. Thanks again so much for watching and tuning in. I hope that you learned something. I know I did as I painted this piece. If you like this kind of content, please let me know by commenting, dropping a like, or subscribing for more. It really helps a lot. Thanks, guys.